Hello again, and welcome to another Monster Mod Customs video. Today we're going to be doing a walk around of the Frankenstein project, and this is my 4x4 project. This is the project that I originally started all of this work on. Back before I got this, I knew a few things. I knew how to change spark plugs, I knew how to do oil changes, maybe get under there and do brakes or things like that, but this is where I really started taking things apart and learning how they went back together. Generally trial by fire for me. I took it apart well before I knew what was going on. Got planes flying around. Let him finish up. Go ahead. But, some backstory for this. This is a 1988 Jeep Comanche. If it looks familiar, just in the front view, for anybody who doesn't know what a Comanche is, you might think that, yeah, that looks a lot like a Cherokee. And that's because it pretty much is. The Jeep Comanche was just a truck bed version of the Jeep Cherokee. Everything up to the cab is all exactly the same as the four-door Cherokees. So it has the same power plant, it had the same axles, it had the same bumpers, it had pretty much all the same parts, which makes this really nice to work on because I can find a lot of parts used or new for relatively cheap because the Cherokee is everywhere. This one came from the northernmost northern peninsula of Michigan. It's way up there, way up in the boonies, and it was originally just an off-road vehicle. That's all the guy used it for. This was his run around and have fun thing. And it was built like that. It was just a disaster. It had cracked windshield. The entire front axle of this thing was about 10 inches, maybe a foot to the right, because they put in whatever track bar they could manage to weld together, which meant, hey, just throw a couple pieces together. As long as it moves, they'll take it. It had dry rotted tires, it had rust problems, it had not very good brakes. In fact, the rear brakes didn't even work on it. Front brakes were, we'll just call that not good, or not very good at least. And it had a bunch of bump steer. It just was a wreck. It was really not meant for any kind of on-road travel. And I went up to Michigan originally. I'd started looking around for these years ago. I've had this for about 12 years now. I've been working on it. But way back then, I had seen one of these before when I was a kid. I saw just the front end of it, and it had kind of the big tires like this has. And I saw the grill, and I said, wow, that looks really cool. I'm going to remember that. And then one day, 12 years ago or so, I did remember it. And I said, hey, let me find out what the vehicle was. I kind of want that as another vehicle. And I did some research, and I found out it was called the Jeep Comanche. And I started looking around for it. It took me 7 to 8 months to find this one specifically. I had been everywhere looking for them. I had driven states away just to find them, and for the most part, they're rust buckets. I had seen probably 4 or 5 of them where I could put my hand through the floor. The frame would crumble if you gripped it too hard, and that was not something I was looking for in a project. Back then, again, I knew almost nothing about taking things apart, putting them back together, and rust was the biggest fear I had, because it's everybody's biggest fear when it comes to vehicles, and especially off-road vehicles or 4x4s or trucks or Jeeps in general. You know what I'm talking about. But this one, I went all the way up to Michigan because this one had parts and pieces on it that I wanted. It came with these axles on it. It came with the 1-ton suspension. It came with some really sketchy 36-inch Super Swamper IROCs. It had basically all the things I wanted. It had the lift already, and that meant I didn't have to spend as much money to do what I wanted to it. I went up there with the intention to just throw some plates on this thing and drive it all the way back home. I live in Maryland. It's a long long trip. And there was no way I was going to be able to drive this thing back. And I realized that when I got up there and saw it. It was a love at first sight thing. I saw this thing and I said, wow, that's awesome. That's exactly what I had in mind. And I could see a lot of potential there. But the realization that I had no way to get this back to my house set in, and I had just about given up hope on it. And I talked to the owner of it, and he really liked this truck. And he knew that I really liked this truck, so he made a deal with me that if I paid the price for the vehicle that he was asking, he said he was planning to have a vacation during the summer with his family, and that he had thought about going to Virginia Beach. So, if I paid the full asking price, he would tow this truck from Michigan, from northern Michigan, all the way down to Maryland for me, which was an excellent deal for me. So, naturally, I did that, obviously. It's sitting right here. And he brought it down, and so I began the work on this thing. When I first got this vehicle, I had a couple other project cars, but I had run out of cars to actually use for a daily driver. So I had to rush to get this thing ready to use as a daily driver. And it had lots of issues, as I explained before. It was undrivable with the bump steer. The tires were very, very sketchy. The axle being way off to the side meant the bump steer was way, way worse. You could go over the smallest bumps and it would shake you to death in there. The gas tank leaked. It had oil leaks. It leaked from pretty much everywhere on this. Axle shafts leaked. Everything leaked on this vehicle. So I started taking things apart and putting them back together and figuring things out on how I could make this work. And eventually, after 6 months, I did. I did get this thing to be able to drive on the road, and boy, what an experience that was. I didn't have a compressor or anything back then, so I couldn't pump up the big 36-inch Super Swampers. So I had to drive it on basically no PSI in the tires, maybe 5 if I'm lucky. It was in perfect crawling territory, but not for driving on the road, and I had to drive it all the way to a gas station to fill these tires up, or those tires up. And that was an adventure. It just had all the body roll just from flopping around on the flat tires going up there. I'll never forget that. It was a lot of fun. I say fun, but it was actually really sketchy. And I drove this thing for probably 4 years, and reasonably, I should not have been driving this. It was extremely unsafe, very sketchy for all that time, but I was much younger and I didn't care as much back then. I didn't understand. But I drove it for 4 years, and around Maryland they love to salt the heck out of the roads when it comes down to winter. If there's a chance of snow, if it gets cold and it's going to rain, they will salt the roads down with everything they've got. And I basically took the rust problem that this had and made it much, much, much worse. And the realization started to set in as I was driving this thing around and looking at it. I couldn't work on it as much because it was my daily driver. So there was no availability for me to fix the problems, and I started seeing more and more things creep up, the worst of which was the rust. And I started to realize, hey, this is not a safe vehicle for me to be driving around. I need something reliable to deal with. And that's when I got my first new car. I've always been an old car person. But that gave me a chance to actually work on this thing. And that's when I started taking things apart that I probably shouldn't have taken apart. But I figured it out over time. So the big deal with this is that there's not really that much I want to do with it anymore. I've done all the hard work. I've taken the whole thing apart, put it back together, taken it apart again, and put it back together again. There are very few things that I'll talk about at the end of this video that I really still want to do with this. It's a 4x4, it's an off-roader, it's a Jeep. Obviously it's never going to be done. There's going to be a bigger, better thing for me to put on here. But for now, I don't have to treat this like I used to treat it, which was I used to take it off of the road for 3-4 months at a time and just take whole swaths of equipment off of this vehicle. I used to pull everything out of the engine bay, the whole front axle, the whole interior, or take the entire rear of the truck apart to paint and rebuild and just fix things. But I don't have to do that anymore. I've already done all of that on this vehicle. So that means that this one I can actually drive around. This is one of the few project vehicles I have that is able to be driven around. I can take this out and enjoy it whenever I want to. That's all for an intro for it. Let's do a walk around of the vehicle. So, one of the first things on the vehicle that I really liked is this bumper. This bumper came with the vehicle when I first purchased it, and I liked it so much I kept it on here. It's a really nice bumper. I have no clue who made it or what company produced these. I've never been able to find it, but I liked it enough that I kept it. So I've bed lined it all. I had to grind it out. There was a bunch of rust in all these little areas over here where it's has that tuck in, but otherwise it's in very, very good structural shape. It's very, very heavy duty. It works well for what I want. I've got the 9,500 pound winch here with the receiver. I've got a flip up license plate holder. In Maryland, you're required to have a front license plate, so it's inconvenient, but I found a way to make that work and still have it look pretty good with what's going on. I've got my eBay, here, let me lift you up a little bit. I've got my eBay off-road lights here, which work pretty well. They have been reliable ever since I bought them and have survived through probably going on 5 years now with these things. I've got the LED headlights. I've changed all of the lights in this vehicle to LEDs. So that includes the markers, the turn signals. The turn signals, as you can see here, have been tinted. And with the LEDs, it shines through very, very bright, even brighter than it was normally. And down here, some of the first things you're going to notice are D44 axle. This came from the 1976 Bronco, I believe. And somewhere in the 70s. It was a 70s Ford axle, D44 and a Ford 9-inch combo. This came with the vehicle. I put the truss on here. It's a TNT Customs truss. Really nice unit that includes the amenities for all the little things that I wanted to put on this. I've got 1-ton steering, and that came with the vehicle. One of the biggest changes you probably see up here is its power assist steering, which is very, very nice for making sure that these 37-inch tires can move. I also have a Curry anti-rock sway bar, so I don't need the disconnects. It has a lot of very good flex to it. I've taken this axle apart time and time again and rebuilt, done ball joints, done seals, and all kinds of stuff. It has chromoly axle shafts in it, a Riddler diff cover, 513 gears with a locker up front here. You can't see it up here, but there is a steering box brace with the holder for the pinion right here, so that this doesn't shift around and crack my frame on this side where the steering box is mounted. I also have a plated frame, 3/16 all the way around, so nothing's ever going to break that. Let's move around to the side. Over here there are some big changes to it. We have welded in 2x8 rockers. Now, this is 1/4-inch steel tube, goes in here, welded up to my cab corners, welded up to the sill plate right here, and then it has some beams that weld it straight to the frame, which I'll show you a little later. I went with a side exit exhaust. I did a whole custom setup. Everything on this vehicle is pretty much custom. I've gone through all the cables, all the lines, all the hydraulics, everything, and redone most of it. This is a 3-inch down to the 2 1/4, I believe. Goes up over the rail to a Flowmaster Super 44. I really like the noise of it. I'll have you listen to it a little bit later when I start this up. And all the way up to the headers. No cat, no nothing like that. Don't need that in Maryland when it's a historic, and this thing definitely doesn't get driven enough to be anything but. I have Napier Precision flares right here. Cut out the bed sides. These bed sides don't feel too bad for them because they were already worked on a long time ago, and most of this is Bondo in the underside of this right here. I don't know who did that work before. They, I guess, worked on it because it had rusted out before, and they put new panels in, and then they put a 1/4 inch, if not more, of Bondo in this spot, so it's kind of a nightmare. So I didn't feel bad about cutting all this stuff out in order to get more clearance, and it gave me a little bit. You can see it's not a ton, but at least it gives me some more depth before it eats these. Another big change, custom trail doors. This was my first welding project. I really wanted a door that stuck with the lines of the body, and a lot of people had done doors where it goes like this and then comes up here, does this weird angle right here. I didn't think that looked good. So I came up with a design that stuck with the body lines, went in, folded down, kept the same distance from the base here, and still retain the mirror. So you can step through this when you're inside of the vehicle. You don't have to open the door. You could just sit on this and lean out if you wanted to. And overall, I think it just looks better than a lot of other trail doors that people have made. I like this design a lot more. It seems more functional, and I think it just keeps with the look of the vehicle a little bit better. I have a roll bar from a Ford Ranger, the 90s Ford Ranger. I say roll bar, but it's not going to save me in any kind of rollover. This is just an aluminum piece. It's mounted to the bed, and that's all. It has no tie-ins to the frame, so it's a light bar, we'll call it that. But it came with the vehicle, and I liked the look of it enough that I kept it and put it back in here. It also blends with the body lines quite well going on here. I have the 37-inch Pitbull rockers, the radial variety, back when you could still get them. They're very nice tires. I went with radials because I needed drivability. I don't have a tow vehicle to really take this back and forth to any kind of trails. So I needed something that was going to be a little nicer on the roads than the old bias ply IROCs. These are some standard 15-inch steel wheels with the Total Metal Innovations weld-on beadlock kit done on them. I really liked the look of these. It's a really nice and easy kit to deal with as long as you knew how to weld, and it didn't require too much in the ways of building to make that work, and I really liked it. But later on I'll explain why these are a difficulty for me. Back here we got the rough country tire carrier for the big 37 back there. This I have to add some structure underneath the bed because that's not good when you're going down the road. Yeah. So I've got to do some structure under here in order to just get it at least stable. I don't like seeing this thing in the mirror vibrating around, especially because it pitches the center of the bed right here and kind of moves this next portion, which is the fuel cell. This is an RCI rock crawler back when they first came out. I saw this. It's the first introduction they did of a bladder style fuel cell, and I tried it out. It is very nice. I'm sure their more recent models are probably a little bit better. This one had a tendency to flex the plastic that's inside of here in the sun, and you can see that my sender is kind of tilted off to the side. It used to be straight a year ago, but it keeps on just flexing itself down. The bracket, the holder that I have here for it is one that I made. It was hell to try to figure out, simply because this fuel cell was not square, so it took a lot of times of putting it together, taking it back apart, grinding out all the welds, putting it together, grinding it out, taking it back apart. And the one time I did frame it with the cell inside of it, it was stuck and I couldn't do anything with it. So it was a real pain to get this done, but in the end it worked. And honestly, I like this a lot more than I do the underbed fuel tank. This works a lot better for me, and it gets things out from underneath, so I can work a little bit easier under there. All AN8 fuel line running all the way up. It's all custom done, so that runs all the way through. My vent line goes up, around, and over in case of a rollover, so I'm not just spilling fuel everywhere or shaking it out. There's a vent on the underside there. You can see that my wheel wells don't exist. Another victim of rust. They were rusting in between the seams right next to the bed and on the bed floor. So I cut them out as just kind of a last-ditch effort. There was no way I was going to be able to get in there and fix that unless I did some really precise cutting and basically tried to reset it to stock. I didn't need to do that. So I made these out of 16 gauge or 14 gauge, I can't remember. It's heavy duty. They don't have any flex to them. So now I've got some removable bolt-in units that I can use and take out whenever I need to. These are my speed holes. This is all for aerodynamics. All the air that comes into the bed can get out through here. And by that I mean these were actually the result of rust that was sandwiched in between these 3 plates of steel back here that was completely inaccessible. So I did this as a solution. I drilled it out, I treated it, and then I bed lined over pretty much the whole thing. You could see some of the rust where it took it out right there. Got just basically I guess 2.5 by 4 steel beam right here. It's just something that came on the vehicle. This is one of the other things I need to change. This rear bumper, it just doesn't match with the rest of the style of the vehicle. I'd like something that takes up a little bit more space at the tailgate. Under here is the Ford 9. You can see that it is all trussed along the back side. I had to make some custom brackets for the shocks in order for them to fit. The shocks are all Skyjacker Black Max. New springs, I believe these are Rubicon Express shackles. And the whole brake setup, you can see I've got 4-wheel disc brakes going on this thing. U-bolt eliminators, mostly because I didn't want to just drill holes through this nice new truss and introduce a place for rust to gather. I do not like rust. I also plated the bottom side of the diff housing with 1/4-inch steel, so if I manage to rub it or bump it against something, it's not going to cave in the whole bottom of it. Over on this side, get another look at some of that rocker right here. Nice solid steel. Fuel door that doesn't do anything yet. I'm thinking about putting air lines to this at some point. We'll take a look under the vehicle and then we can take a look inside. So under here you can see the tie-ins from the rock rails, we'll call them that. They're attached to the body though, they're non-removable. Ties in with 2x2 1/4-inch steel into the frame. Again, this frame is all 3/16 plated, so it's very, very solid where it's attaching to. I have the old TNT Customs Y-Link kit, the long arm kit here. Nowadays they have a division right here so that you can remove just this plate in the case that you need to deal with your transfer case rather than removing the entire thing. May upgrade to that, but I've never found a reason to quite yet. We have an MP231 with a slip yoke eliminator, a custom drive shaft going all the way back. It's got the Yukon pinion. Inside of there is another set of 513s. It has the Yukon Grizzly locker. Originally I had a spool inside of this, or a mini spool rather, and then one day it self-destructed. It actually broke itself in half and sheared the carrier pin inside of it. Fortunately it didn't kill my gears or the housing itself, so I was able to recover that. I basically just rebuilt this entire axle, took it all apart, welded on new leaf spring mounts, put the truss on it. You can see a better view of the plate on the underside here just for protection. Everything under here is bed lined, as you can see. Up there is the bottom of the bed. You can really see where some of that rust was starting to peek through, and it kind of weakened the whole structure. I got kind of lucky, but another reason I got rid of the gas tank is because If you've ever worked on one of these, or really in any pickup truck from the time period, they might even still be the same now. They have these big band straps that go around them and have just a hook that goes in up here. That whole thing was rusted out, so half of my tank was hanging, and that really wasn't working for what I was trying to do here. So look at the exhaust, how it comes around, goes up over the frame there and out the bedside. The Super 44, that just cannot stay painted for some reason. I'll throw another coat on there. Here's my, looks rather ugly, but is functional fuel setup. Because I went with a fuel cell, I had to find a way to incorporate a pump and filter into it, since I took basically the first stage of that away by removing the gas tank that was up here. So I've got my pre-filter right here, which is 100 micron. I have my pump right here attached to the frame rail. Again, all run with the AN line. And I have my 10 micron filter right there, going all the way up into the engine bay. Up front here, I've got the AX15 manual transmission. Came with the vehicle. Another reason I purchased this, I really wanted a manual. And this thing is great. I really, really like this transmission, and it's held out very, very well for me so far. Up there you can see my rear main seal leak that for some reason never gets fixed. I hate that thing. I've replaced it probably 6 times, and every time it comes back. Never ending, never ending. You can see, actually, before we go anywhere, up in here, I switched the bell housing to the external slave cylinder style because this is just much easier to work on and prime and plumb and all of that. And I've insulated the entirety of the underside here. When you don't have carpet on your floors, it gets hot really fast. So, here's a better look at the doors. Got a door handle right here, just the regular Jeep half door handles that I chopped the latch rod down on and custom fit to it. Opens up. Pull the key. We don't want to listen to that. These are just regular run-of-the-mill Jegs bucket seats. I bought them because the old seats in here were very, very stained and messy and uncomfortable, and I wanted something that retained the bucket but also didn't cost $1,000 for them. So I got these, and honestly, they're pretty comfortable and they fit very well for the space that I had. I had to custom make a bracket for them. I used the old mounting plates, and then I just created a frame out of some 1x1 steel tube and some angle iron, something like this could mount to. Got the shift right here. I installed, no Comanche ever came with a handbrake like this. They were always a pedal, and I really didn't want to do a 4th pedal down there and crowd up the space any more than it already is. So I custom made this setup. It is a pain and it doesn't work right now, which is another of the issues I have to fix with this. Rest of the dash is just the regular square style. I never upgraded because I think this looks better. I think these Jeeps looked better with this kind of boxy feel to them. Some auxiliary switches. These ones have yet to be wired to anything. They're just there as an extra. These ones are my additional fan and my fog lights. I also did some custom speaker brackets under here to fit where they would have gone in the Cherokee. I don't know if the Comanche ever came with these. My lack of a hood opener, and here's a lot of the custom work. So as I said before, this thing had a lot of rust issues on it. And something that is not readily apparent just by looking at this because of the work that was done was that the whole rear section of this frame is from a different Comanche. This thing had so much rust on it that I was getting holes all the way up through here, and it actually had one of these leaf spring hangers separate from the frame entirely. on this side, and the other side wasn't much better. So I had to take this around. I went to pretty much everybody I could find to see if somebody would help me. I really liked this truck. I did not want to get rid of it, and a lot of people, especially with the money I've invested in this thing, would have sent this to a scrap yard 5 times over. I didn't want to do that. I really love this truck. So I asked around. I couldn't find anybody for ages, and I almost all but given up. And then I found somebody who has a shop. They're not a professional mechanic or anything like that, but he does dump truck frame welding and things like that. So he's got the jig set that he can put this thing in and get it leveled up, and the experience to know how to do it. I took it over to him and his brother, and they did that for me, because I definitely didn't have the know-how or the equipment to do something like that. They're also the people that did these rock rails. I didn't have the ability to weld that stuff back then. Welding was really intimidating to learn, but we'll talk about that some other time. But this is half of another Comanche right here that they cut the rear end off, they set it up on the jig, they pulled the new one in, got it trimmed down to where it needed to be, welded it on, and then did the fish plate over top of it and gave it back to me. So this truck was on death's door. It was 1 foot in the grave at a point in time, maybe 2 feet in the grave. This thing was ready to go. It was ready to give up and just not have to deal with it anymore. But they really brought this thing back, and that restored a lot of my interest in this, because originally, when you have a problem like that, you think, well, what's the point in investing more money into it if I can't even be sure that it's going to be drivable in the future? Finally got it drivable again, and that's where this is at. But that was not the end of my rust issues. No, not even close to the end of my rust issues. While it did have most of the significant damage right at the sweep right there for the frame, where it goes up to the wheel and then down to the leaf spring hanger, there was still a significant amount of damage underneath the entire cab section. And that's what we'll look at now. I had to take whole sections of the frame underneath this cab and cut them out. And this was when I was more comfortable with doing all of this stuff. Replaced them before I plated the entire frame. Now, anybody who's seen the inside of a Cherokee or a Comanche knows that there's usually some kind of a top frame brace that goes across the entire floor here. And that thing just holds water in. It is a pain. It has no drainage underneath this forward section, and it basically, that's where most of them rust. They'll rust through right there because there's no way for that to drain out or to get cleaned. You can't even see it. It's a huge pain. I did not want to put that back on, so I did this another way. Underneath here is a section of steel that just fits right in between the rail, just below this steel plate here. This whole floor was cut out and replaced at one point. It might not look like it. These ridges right here were just because the person who made this panel wanted it to look as factory as possible, and they did a good job. But I still had to cut big sections out just to fit this in, to get this done. That was when I pulled the cap off of this and found that it was non-existent under there. So I did that. I welded up some sections in here just to give some strength to the top of the frame that it would be missing without having that cap. The metal is 3/16 steel, so it's much thicker than the body metal that was in here before. That the frame cap was made out of. And then one of my custom things that I did here was for this whole section, this is a 1/4-inch steel plate with grade 8 bolts. And it runs all the way back to here. So now, if ever I need to work on this vehicle, or I need to get in there to deal with the rust, because that was a significant amount of rust too, just inside of here. It took me ages of grinding and doing wire brushes to try to clean all this out and vacuum it out. I don't want to deal with that again, and getting into this frame is a pain. So I did this as a solution. 1/4-inch steel plate over top, mounted with grade 8 bolts. And now, whenever I need to get in here, whenever I want to check it, I just remove the seat, take out all these bolts, and I can pull that plate out itself and look inside of here and clean it, retouch up the paint, put some corrosion inhibitor, basically anything. I can do whatever I want, and I don't have to worry as much about that section of frame that used to be so weak. Take a look at the engine here. You can see on the hood here, I've got some hood vents up on top just to help with some of the cooling process. This truck used to get very, very hot, and I needed some kind of solution to prevent that. That was part of it. Here is the engine. It is the inline 6 from a slightly later model. This came from a 94 Cherokee. I have all kinds of custom stuff going on here. I have the Thor cowl intake, very nice, gets a lot of nice cooler air in there. I have the late model, early 2000s intake in here that you have, it works well, it's a much better airflow pattern. You just have to cut this section off in order to get it to mount up properly. You can see the AN lines came up here. You can see I have had problem with heat soak before because everything is insulated and guarded in here. But that ended up being because this cylinder head had warped at one point. It hadn't blown through the gasket quite yet, but it was completely warped. I took it out and I had a 1/4 inch of pitch between the center and the two sides. So when it would get warm, it would just barely start to get that blow-by going and cause it to run really, really poorly after it got warm. We have the state-of-the-art zip ties, because for whatever reason, getting this cable is absolutely impossible. Nobody has this cable. I have ordered it a couple of times. They tell me, yep, it's going to send out. It doesn't send out. They tell me, we're holding off for a little bit. There's some supply issues, and then it disappears into the ether. Nothing exists anymore. They say, we're sorry. They pay me the money back, and that's it. So I have my highly sophisticated zip ties holding that in for now until I can find one. Maybe I can pull one from a junkyard. Pretty much every sensor in here is new. The throttle body's been gone through. I've cleaned it out, polished it. I have, as part of that whole RAM assist setup, this is a power steering pump from a 5.2 V8. I had heard that these move more fluid than the standard pump that came on these, so I bought one. I did have to drill out the little valve inside of this in order to let more flow so I didn't have cavitation issues, because using the old one is too restrictive and it causes some issues with cavitation. You'll get a lot of foaming in here. So I preempted that just by drilling that out. I wanted to retain the belt tensioner that is basically this entire power steering pulley, so I had to do some custom work to the pulley to make that fit. This plate is the old one from the old pulley. This bracket is one from the old pulley, and I had to grind it down, customize it a little bit to make it fit well up against this. I made this bracket just to give a little more rigidity to it, and I had to tap both sides of the pump's bolt holes to make sure that I could pull from both sides. In the end, it worked out very, very well. I managed to make it so that it retained. The only issue I had was that this pump was about a 1/4 inch back that way, which set my belt out of alignment and caused my belts to wear down and start squeaking after, I don't know, 200 miles. I was replacing belts every couple of months for a long time. Eventually, I just pushed it forward, found a way to space all this stuff out. Now, I don't get as much belt squeal anymore. It's squealing right now, but this belt's been on here for probably 2 years now. And it's seen a lot of hot and cold cycles because I don't drive this as often as I probably should. So the original 5.2 had another amenity for pulling fluid in here. I don't need that, so that's capped off. I've got the single that goes down to the steering box, and actually, that doesn't go to the steering box. I have a power steering cooler on this, and that's where it goes to first before it goes to the steering box. And that's mounted right there. And then it goes to the steering box. The steering box I had out at one point in time. I rebuilt it. While I was in there, I drilled and tapped it in order to get the hydraulic lines that could go out to the ram. The cooling setup is a 3-core or 3-row radiator. The old one was really, really rough. It was falling apart. All the fins were basically just corroded away. You could brush your finger across it and put holes in it. So I went with a newer one. I had all kinds of overheating issues, I think I mentioned. Maybe, just maybe, a cause for the head, but it's been doing that for a while. I replaced so many components in here: new water pump, new thermostat housing, new thermostat. I went with an all-electric system on this because I wanted something a bit more reliable that didn't soak up my horsepower from the engine. And you can see it fits. It just barely fits. You can see right there how tight that tolerance is for that to work. But this is a triple fan setup from Monster Cooling. I believe the shroud is a rough country piece. 2 of these fans run on a thermostat, which is right there. I really didn't want to put it in line. I know it's not the best situation. I would much rather have put it right here, but this one, even if it's not operating any fans directly, because I don't have that electric fan in here anymore, it still sends the temperature out to the computer. So if you unplug this, your engine runs really poorly. So I had to find a way to maintain this. I tried to find ways to drill it into the housing here and make it fit, but there's just no way where it had enough thread space to seal, or it didn't just conflict with some other kind of flow here. So the easiest method was just to cut that hose in half and put it right in there, which worked out. It does work really well. This truck almost never gets over 200 degrees these days. This fan is on a switch, so that's on the inside. In case I need a little bit of extra cooling, I could just pop that over and kick that on. I did a lot of custom wiring to this. I took this whole harness apart and recovered it, retaped it. I added my own wiring into it because I don't like loose wires just kind of hanging around everywhere in here. I went to a dual diaphragm brake booster, better braking power. It's really nice for my 4-wheel disc brakes. This is a proportioning unit from, I think, a 96. They're flying jets again. They like to do that around here. But this is a 96 proportioning valve, which is when they had the 4-wheel discs on the Grand Cherokees. But this does not work that well. I still don't get a whole lot of braking response out of the rears. So that'll be something else I'll change to a Willwood unit or something like that. Because Willwood makes one where you can dial what you want out of the rear. So I can adjust it to have a better rear braking profile and not work my front brakes quite as much. I have the upgraded motor mounts. Again, all kinds of plating around the steering box for the steering box. The electrical for the fans, like I said, I don't want to have cords and wires just running everywhere. This one's an exception just because it was an afterthought. But for all of these wires and everything, I actually wired them into the harness while I had it apart, and you can kind of see right down there where it goes into the harness. I made an extension for the harness that comes all the way forward here and attaches. And all of that runs up into the power distribution center, and all of the relays and fuses that I didn't, or that wouldn't be used by this vehicle, I wired in to work with these. So all of the fans are relayed, and so are the fog lights in here, in the box, like it's stock, which I really like. I like that look. There's some other custom stuff in here. It's not really too huge, just made a bracket so I could have the vacuum canister sitting up here rather than just tucked in somewhere loose. Ballistic fab battery hold down. These are hood pins from Bleep and Jeep. They work really well, and I like them a lot. and it gets rid of that cable going through the inside all the way out. Have my vent lines all right there through an ARB venting system, both of my axles and my transfer case. The transmission just vents to air. I don't know how or where, but I've had the thing out and it has no vents. Otherwise, there's not much else unique on that. Let me set you up and we can start it up and you can hear it. I think it has a nice idle sound. Confuses some people every now and then because they think there's a V8 in here when it's just the inline 6. Got a little bit of condensation for a first start. Not too bad. I should probably let it run longer so I don't end up with more condensation in there. But now it's time to talk about the problems with this vehicle. The things that I want to fix now. First and foremost, one of the biggest things is I need to do something about this paint. This paint was done in this exact driveway with Rust-Oleum rattle cans. And man, all told, it's lasted for 5 years now. Still looks pretty good from 5 foot away. But once you get up close, you can see that it is not that good. It's starting to get some little crow's feet and crackles in the primer right here. We've got some issues with cracking there. You can see that right here. We've got a place where it just stripped off, and that's on me. That's poor preparation. I didn't get a good coat of primer on there, or I didn't sand it properly. You can see little edges where the door's flaking, spots where it's just coming up. And again, for a rattle can job, it didn't do that bad. Some runs right there, right there. There are runs pretty much everywhere. So it lasted for quite a while. There's a really good crack right there just because, like I said before, there's, you know, a 1/4 inch of Bondo underneath of that thing. Spot right there where I had to redo the paint. Overspray because I didn't tape it properly when I did the bed liner. Degradation of the body underneath. I really don't want that. Like I said, I don't like rust. So I'm gonna have to figure out something to do about the paint on this truck. And whether I do that myself or I take it to a shop, I am not entirely sure. I don't want to spend an arm and a leg, especially because it's a vehicle that's just going to go off-roading. But I still want it to look nice, and more importantly, I want it to last. There's another good example right there, something I got to take care of. That is actually a crack in the weld work that's causing it to crack on the outside here, so I didn't get a good enough weld penetration on that edge. I'll need to grind all that off and do some touches on the welds, probably check the whole thing while I'm at it. So that's number one. Number two, I got to figure out what's going on with my brakes. This brake is terrible. It works just long enough for me to forget that it ever stopped working, and then it'll lock up. It won't seize, but you can definitely tell when you go to brake, it pulls hard. I get a lot of brake fade. And when I'm trying to get up to speed, if it's locked, I'm basically stuck at 45 miles an hour. I cannot go faster because this is holding me back. And that's, I've bled these brakes probably 6 or 7 times, and it just keeps coming back. So I'm just going to take that apart. It could be something up in my proportioning valve, which is another reason why I want to change that. The other issue with driving is these wheels. As I said before, I really like them. I like the look, but they do not balance. So all that drivability I gained by going to radials is almost non-existent because of these these wheels. I don't know if it's because the weld wasn't perfect all the way around, so maybe I have a little bit more weld on one side, or if I somehow managed to knock it out of square after I leveled it off before it got welded. I'm not sure, but they are unbalanceable. These are all bead balanced, so they work pretty well. I've bead balanced all my tires on this truck, and it always worked, except for these. This, when you get to the 30 to 50 mile an hour range, bumps up and down a lot. And it's not something that makes you feel unsafe, but it makes it very uncomfortable to drive this thing. It's something that's just kind of an annoyance more than it is a real issue or a real concern. But eventually that's going to start wearing my ball joints. That's going to start wearing my TREs. The whole front end components are going to start having issues because of that. Also, it's really annoying when that keeps hitting. So, got to fix that. Another issue I've got, I don't know if you'll be able to see it because there's another car in the way here, but that edge, that one right over there, that corner, it's low. For some reason it's tucked down about, I don't know, ½ an inch. And it might not be noticeable to everybody, but I notice it when I'm walking around this thing. Now, part of that is because my shackle, for some reason, I'd swear I measured it, but for some reason is improperly leveled. So I've got about a ¼ inch I can take out of the threads on that. So one more turn to bring that down. But this edge is low. And I know probably the exact reason that that happened. When these came out from factory, they all got leveled at the factory, and they all had these little clips that were underneath each mounting section of the bed. I don't have any of those. They were rusted to nothingness originally. So I never knew where exactly the mounting was for this. And now I know I've got to raise that corner up probably another ¼ inch, ½ an inch maybe. ½ an inch is a little extreme. But get that. Oh, I guess I forgot to mention what the plan was for the wheels. I want to go aluminum. Aluminum, I still want to keep the bead locks. I think the bead locks are very, very useful in an off-road setting. And I really like the look. Aluminums will make it easy because this is the stock inline 6. Granted, it's the high output and it's got a few mods to it, but these things don't produce a ton of power. Moving, what are these, 110, 120 pound per tire, per wheel in its entirety. And that's a lot of rotating mass. It's hard for it to move sometimes, even if it does have 513 gears. So if I can lessen that load on it, that'll make the drivability a little bit better. Plus, having a pre-made wheel rather than one that I've made myself will mean that it is probably going to have a much better chance of being balanced. The unfortunate part of that is that 15-inch wheels, especially in bead locks, and especially aluminum, are extremely hard to come by, which it is to say that there's one company that makes them and they don't make them anymore. So I'd have to find some older ones or some legacy that somebody's trying to sell off. I do not know at some point. But that'll give me a lot more drivability back. I'll be able to take this longer distances without fear of basically blowing out the ball joints on this thing eventually, or my shocks or things like that. The rear main, yeah, gotta find a way to fix that. Don't know why it always does that. What a pain. I do have some slack in the steering right now, which I'm pretty sure is just the retainer for the the steering at the front there, and it's giving a little bit of slide, so I'll have to tighten that down and find a way to keep that tight. I need to replace the windshield at some point. This is not terrible. It doesn't look terrible from here. I don't like this trim. This trim just comes up all the time, and it doesn't look good, so I want to switch to the later model Cherokee with the rubber trim. That way I don't have to worry about plastic anymore. And this window, despite how it looks, I welded on the inside of this vehicle, so it might not be easy to see, but there's a lot of little dots and sprinkles all over it of weld slag that has embedded itself into that glass. Now eventually, just for the sake of the springs and the spring tap that always happens on here, I would like to go to coilovers. But trying to package coilovers in the engine bay, it might not be an issue on this side. I can find a way to make that work, but on that side, where the PDC is mounted and the coolant reservoir and all that, it's gonna be a lot more difficult to work in there. So maybe sometime in the future I'll switch to coilovers, which would eliminate any kind of spring tap that comes from the coils. But that's way, way off into the future. And that's pretty much the basic plans for this, which may sound like a lot, but it really, by comparison to the other two projects, is not that big a deal. It's mostly just money that holds me back on this one. That's all for the walk around for Frankenstein here. I'll be sure to take the camera with me on trips when I go off-roading or I go to shows. I've taken this to shows a bunch of times before. I've got 5 awards in the house for this thing. It's a head turner, and I like driving it around and taking it places and getting to use it as it's intended. If you have any questions or comments about the truck, or suggestions, things that I might not think about when it comes down to it, maybe you know of a source of wheels that would be really, really good on here that don't involve spending $3,000 more on tires, that'd be great. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video.